Good morning, church family. I hope this message finds you doing well this morning, and I hope as we are getting more and more into our summer months that you are able to be creative and find some enjoyable, fun family vacations to take part in these coming months. And so as we dive into the Word of God, if you will please join me this morning in 1 Samuel. We're going to be in chapters 29 and chapter 30. And so again, 1 Samuel chapters 29 and 30. And before we begin, I think it's always wise to have a bit of context for what we're talking about. And so we're continuing in the passage in the narrative of David in the land of the Philistines. And again, I hope this doesn't get lost on us of the magnitude of what we're talking about here, that David, who has already been anointed by Samuel, king of Israel, finds himself now seeking refuge and shelter in the land of his enemies. He finds that it is safer for him to be in the Philistine territory than in his own home. And so that's where David is at in this point. And so he is finding favor with Achish, the ruler of Gath, of the Philistine capital. And so Achish had given David some land, and in return of that favor, the expectation is that David would go out and do battles with the Philistines as well. And so as we pick up in chapter 29, we find that the Philistine army is marching to do their next big battle with the Israelites. And so the Israelite army is getting ready, and the Philistine army is on the march to get ready for this big battle. And at this point, Achish has asked David to come and to join them in the battle. And so David, as we pick up in verse 4, David finds himself marching with the Philistines to do battle with the Israelites. So here we go. 1 Samuel chapter 29, beginning verse 4. But the Philistine commanders were angry with him, with Achish, and said, "Send David back, that he may return to the place that you have assigned him. He must not go with us into battle, or he will turn against us during the fighting. How better could he regain his master's favor than by taking the heads of our own men? Isn't this the David they sang about in their dances? Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands." Jump down with me, if you will, to verse 11. So David and his men got up early in the morning to go back to the land of the Philistines, and the Philistines went up to Jezreel. And David and his men reached Ziklag on the third day. Now the Amalekites had raided the Negev and Ziklag. They had attacked Ziklag and burned it, and had taken captive the women and all who were in it, both young and old. They killed none of them, but carried them off as they went on their way. When David and his men came to Ziklag, they found it destroyed by fire, and their wives and sons and daughters taken captive. So David and his men wept aloud until they had no strength left to weep. David's two wives had been captured, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel. Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel. David was greatly distressed because the men were talking of stoning him. Each one was bitter in spirit because of his sons and daughters. But David found strength in the Lord his God. This is the word of the Lord. As we come back to chapter 29, and as we come back to the beginning of our passage here, we see that David is on the march with the Philistine army again to go to battle against the Israelites. And so if we can even just try to attempt to figure out what is going on inside of David's head and the inner struggle that is going on inside of David as he's marching out to do battle. And we know that at this point in time, David is living in the enemy territory, and if David would refuse Achish, the ruler of Gath, if he refused the call to go and do battle with him, there would have been nothing stopping Achish to send the Philistine army upon David and his men and his family. And so for David, saying no was not a good option, was not a realistic option for him for the safety of his family, himself, and his fighting men, his trusted men beside him. And so he was in a tough spot because he couldn't readily say no to Achish, the ruler of Gath. But at the same time, it's not lost on him, and it should not be lost on us as the readers to see that David, again, being anointed by Samuel, king of Israel, is now marching out to do battle against the Israelites. And so David is in a very, very tricky spot right now. And, I think of this, we use that phrase today of being stuck between a rock and a hard place. And I think that is exactly where David is at as he's marching out to do battle, is that he is stuck between a rock and a hard place. He can't readily say no to the Philistines at this point in time, but he knows that he is heading out to do battle against his own people. And so where do you turn when you find yourself between a rock and a hard place? What do you do when that becomes a situation that you find yourself in? And it, the text doesn't specifically say this, but you almost have to kind of wonder what was going on in David's mind. Like, if he was questioning, like, God, where are you at in all of this? God, I believe in you. I trust you. I know that you are working out good in all situations, but God, I can't see you in what is happening. It is a lot of things have to be going through David's mind right now, and a lot of questions and a lot of deep questions going in and through his mind. And as we turn back to the text, this is where it's very fascinating that God has been working throughout all of this. And throughout all of David's life, even as David was running from Saul and in the Israelite territory, God was keeping him protected and providing for David on the run. And even as he was now living in Philistine territory, God was providing for David still and providing a home and a shelter for David, even in enemy territory. And even here now, as David is marching out to do battle, again, stuck between a rock and a hard place, God is working behind the scenes, working out all things for good. That the rulers of the Philistine army, so we have the army out ahead, and then we have David and his 600 fighting men behind, and then behind them we have the rulers of the Philistines. And the Philistines start to have this conversation amongst themselves. And the text doesn't specifically say it, but as I read this, I have to see that God was at work instigating this conversation. God was at work equipping people's hearts to question the motive of David as they're going out. And so some of the Philistine commanders were questioning Achish, and they were questioning his judgment, and they were questioning him in general and saying, can we really trust that David is on our side? Can we really trust that when we go out and we engage in the battlefield, that David won't turn on us to try to win back the favor of the Israelites, so that he could try to win back the good favor of the current king of Israel, Saul? Are we sure that David isn't doing this to work against us and not for us? And so this debate starts to go back and forth between the commanders as they're marching out to do the battle. And through the course of the debate, Achish is strong in favor of David, and he is in complete support and trust that David is for them, but he can't convince the other rulers. And so at the end of the conversation, Achish has to go to David and send him and his fighting men home. Again, I hope we don't lose how God is working behind the scenes, that as David had found himself stuck between this rock and this hard place, he couldn't say no to Achish without threat to his closest men beside him, his fighting men and his family. But he's also in a tough spot that he's essentially going out to do battle against his own people. He's stuck between this rock and a hard place, and God provides a way for him. God provides the answer that David doesn't have to make that decision. God was there to provide it for him. And so what's really encouraging about this is that this is the same God that we believe in today. That this morning, if you find that you are stuck in maybe a similar situation, or maybe in your own context, a situation for your own context, that you find yourself stuck between a rock and a hard place, my prayer and my hope this morning is that you would turn to the Lord, is that you would give that situation up to God and be honest with God of the struggle that you find yourself in, and that your faith would be strong enough that you could trust that God is working behind the scenes, and that when you're not able to see God actively at work in the happenings of your life, that your faith is still strong enough to know and to trust that God is still working behind the scenes, working out the good in all situations. And so we see that David and his men are sent back to go back home to Ziklag, and that God provided the out for David. And again, we see how God provided in another way here too, another answer to a prayer that was never offered by David. But as they were going out for this battle, the Amalekites had come and raided the Negev of Israel, and also then went on to Ziklag in the Philistine territory, Ziklag, where David and his family was living. And so they had gone and raided it all, and they burned Ziklag down. And so what's unique about this and what's special about this is, as the Philistine commanders could not come to an agreement on David's part with their army, they sent him home. And because they sent him home, David was able to go and still have time to catch up to the raiding Amalekite army to retrieve what was his. And so now we're moving on into chapter 30, and we see what wasn't spoken of, what wasn't read in our passage this morning. And certainly I hope that even though we stopped at verse 6, I hope that you take the time to go and continue reading to the end of the chapter. Continue reading what we didn't get to read part of this message this morning, but to read the chapter in its whole and to see for yourself how this plays out. But God provides again for David that David and his men are able to go and catch up to the raiding army and retrieve all that was taken from them. And so God is again working behind the scenes, providing for David. But we see what is so unique about this. If we remember, going back to where we were last week in chapter 27, David was going on his own raiding parties in chapter 27, and he was going into the land of the Amalekites, and he was going and he was taking the plunder, but for anybody who was there to witness what he was doing, he was putting them all to death. And so women, children, men, anyone who was seeing what he was doing, David was putting them to death. And so the Amalekites now decide that they're going to return the favor. And once David and his fighting men are out of town, the Amalekites jump on this opportunity. They seize an opportunity to get back at David, to get even with him. And so they go into Ziklag and they take all of the plunder, all of the livestock, take the wives and the women and the children, and then they burn the village to the ground. But they don't kill any of the wives or the family members. I think that is crucial here, that God was providing for David and his fighting men, that these Amalekites who had already lost so much at the hand of David earlier, they didn't take the innocent lives of these women and children and the livestock that were there. Rather, they decided that they were going to take it all and take it all back home with them. That the wives and the sons and daughters would be their victories of war, if you will, and the livestock would become their own and their own part of their own wealth now. But all of this is to say that none of David's family members, none of his wives, and none of the family members of the 600 fighting men that were with David, none of them lost a loved one in this raid that had happened. And if we counter that, we see that God is protecting these individuals at play. God is protecting David. God is protecting the family units of these fighting men. And so again, while David and his men at this point in time were marching out to war, God was still working behind the scenes and protecting the lives of these innocent people from the Amalekites. And so we see that David comes back to Ziklag, and they're tired from their 3-day journey, and they come back to their hometown and they see it burned to the ground, and everything that they have, family and livestock and wealth, they see that it's all taken away and gone. And what is so powerful about this passage is that the closest people to David in his life now come to a tipping point where even they are talking of stoning him. Now let's keep in mind that these 600 fighting men that are with David, they were with David when he was fleeing from Saul in Israelite territory. These same men were with David as he went and left the refuge of their own nation of Israel to go and to flee into the Philistine territory. These 600 men went with him to live in the land of the enemies. These 600 men would go with him on these raiding parties. These 600 men would go and they would die at the sword so that David could live. They would take their own life so that David could live. They were his trusted men that were surrounding him. They were loyal to David to a fault. They were just his best friends and companions in all of life situations. And now they find that they are in a position where they aren't even sure what to do with David at this point. They aren't sure if they can trust that David really has out what's best for them, because they don't know what's happened to their wives, to their sons and daughters. They don't know what's happened to their family while they were out marching for the battle. They just know that as they've come back, they've lost everything. And in the midst of that grief, in the midst of that confusion, there starts this conversation of putting David to the death, of stoning him out of response of their loss. And so again, coming back to a theme that is happening in this passage, God provides. God provides for David in that as David is reaching out. And that's a very important distinction that is spoken of here in verse 6. But David, in the midst of all of this, David found strength in the Lord his God. And then verse 7 and following, David goes to Abiathar, the priest, and he calls out to God to see what God would have them do next. And so in some of David's lowest points in life, that even his most trusted allies are turning against him, David turns to God. David turns to God in these times of need. This is drastically different than what is happening in Saul's life. Remember, all of this is going on while Saul is actively reigning king in Israel. And Saul, as we see in chapter 28, and we kind of passed over this chapter, and we'll get back to this at some point. But Saul, knowing that the Philistines are coming to do battle against him, Saul decides to go to a spiritist, to a medium, and he calls on her to raise up the spirit of Samuel. And that very, very fascinating chapter and passage of all that is going on there, we're not going to dive into it now, but the contrast between what Saul does in his time of need is to go to a spiritist, to a medium, to find an answer for things. What David does is he turns to the Lord for help. A very stark contrast between the two kings of Israel that are anointed at this time, that Saul will turn to human means to find an answer, where David is turning to the Lord for the answer for his problems and deliverance. And as we see in chapters 29 and 30, and that God does respond, and God shows up, and God is there for David and his fighting men. But I hope we don't, I don't want to jump to the deliverance too soon, because as we see what's happening in David's life, and David is in an incredibly challenging spot during this point in his life, if we can just think of the events of his life that have led up to his town Ziklag being burned to the ground, David, being anointed king of Israel, is on the run for his life from Saul, who has gotten paranoid and actively seeking to take his life so that Saul can maintain his kingdom, maintain his reign as king in Israel. And so David is running from Saul, which is a very difficult place to be in life. But then also, David finds himself fleeing to find shelter in the enemy territory. And so David goes from one bad situation to another difficult situation. And then David finds himself not only living in enemy territory, but now he's marching out to do battle against his own people. And so David goes from one bad situation to another difficult situation to another bad situation. And so it just seems like it keeps getting worse and worse and worse for David. And then David finds himself that he's not going to battle anymore because the Philistines don't actually trust him. But as he comes back home, he finds that everything he has, the people that he loves, and all of what he's accumulated there in Ziklag has been taken and burned to the ground. And so it just seems like at this point in David's life, it goes from bad to worse to worse to worse. And that no matter what David does or takes part in, the situation around him, he finds himself getting worse and worse before his eyes. Now this morning, maybe you find yourself in a similar situation. Again, maybe what's going on in your life and the context that you find yourself in is that you have just gone in life from one bad situation to the next, and you just can't seem to get ahead in life. And the more you struggle and the more you try, it just seems like everything around you keeps getting worse and keeps crumbling down around you. And though I don't want to minimize any of those struggles or any of those trials, but I hope that through this passage, through what we're reading and studying this morning, that you can remember and that your faith can stand strong to remember that God is working behind the scenes, that God hasn't forgotten you. It's not lost on God what is all going on in your life and where you find yourself at now. And if you can't see how God is moving in your life, I pray and hope that you can still have the faith and the trust to know that God is working behind the scenes. And this really brings me back to what is spoken of in the New Testament in the book of James, this thought of, and again, to David's credit, David never gives up in all of this. And when David is at his lowest point, he turns to God. And there's this real profound sense of perseverance through the hardships that we see in David's life. And so if we turn to James chapter 1, looking at verses 2 through 4 here, James writes, "Consider it pure joy, my brothers, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith develops perseverance. Perseverance must finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything." Again, I'm going to repeat verse 4. Perseverance must finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. Could it be possible that some of the things that God has allowed us to go through, some of the hardships and the trials in life that we are walking through because God is working on our own nature, because God is working to make us more mature individuals in society, that God is working in and through us, that our faith would be mature, that we wouldn't be infants in our faith, but that we would grow up in maturity, that God would be completing things about us that we need to work on? Is it possible that God is allowing these things to happen in our life that we could be better at the end of it than we were when we went into it? This concept of perseverance is you don't persevere through the good times. You enjoy the good times. You relish those good times that you have in life, but you persevere through the challenges, through the trials, through the tribulations, and we get the sense that if we have the strong enough faith to know that God is working behind the scenes, that we persevere through those hardships in life, maybe we can have the faith to trust that God is working out all things for the good, but that he's also working in and through us so that we might be more mature and complete in our faith, and that our love for God in the end would be more than it is at this current moment. Hopefully we have this trust that even in the trial and the tribulation, that God is still working in all things.